Joe Rogan, Jeremy Renner, talking about Jeremy's near-death experience. And although they don't ask this question, and I'll do my best to try to expand the dialogue without putting words in their mouth. Of course, I sift through these things from a biblical Christian worldview, and so I will apply some of that, but hopefully, again, not trying to put words in their mouth. And one of the questions that I heard in the backdrop of this that was not asked, but for me, I'll ask it is, um, maybe suffering is not my enemy. Maybe suffering is not my enemy. And as a Christian person, this is probably one of the biggest obstacles to coming to belief in God or even the goodness of God. Because, of course, as the Bible says, God is all powerful. God is in control of this world. Okay, check. God is good. Okay, check. Wait, hold on. There's pain and suffering and evil and death in this world. So what then do you do with that idea? If you believe God is all good, then why is there pain and suffering in this world? If you believe God is all powerful, then he certainly should be able to do something about that suffering. And so it's not easy. Like, I will be honest, it is not easy. And so if you're hanging out, thanks for being with me as we jump right into it. But I think if we go through it, if we can go through the conversation, we will arrive on the other end with a greater sense of what's going on, and maybe like a more deep and meaningful sense of the suffering that we all experience and we can't avoid. So
does this, I mean, it must forever change your perspective on life because you've crossed back.
Yeah. Well, it just made it easier. It's ripped away all the white noise, things I gave credence to, things I gave value to, just meaningless. Bullshit is gone.
Yeah.
And I just don't. Yeah, I just don't do things I don't give value to. I only do things that are valuable in my life. That's it. That is it. I do nothing else.
It is amazing how much time and energy people put into things that ultimately at the end of the life, they're not valuable.
Yeah.
They don't mean anything.
Yeah.
And they occupy most of your thinking.
That's right. Or even your time, or like your career. Right?
Yeah.
How many people do careers that they fucking hate?
Yeah.
Or they're in a marriage, they despise, all this stuff is spending too much time doing what?
Right.
Why? Because of fear, get trapped, and it's too difficult to get out, and they get too deep and buried into some place that they get, I don't know, paint themselves in a corner. It's quite sad.
It is sad, but it's also, I mean, there's an amazing example that you can shine to the rest of the world that maybe people don't have to go through what you went through to realize that most of what you're thinking about all day, especially if you're one of those people that's wrapped up in social media, most of the things you're thinking about all day are just nonsense.
Yeah.
Just total nonsense that's stealing your life.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I wrote the book is I hope there's things that I learned and the gifts that I received from passing and coming back and overcoming huge obstacles, and a lot of people can identify with suffering and struggle. Doesn't have to be a physical struggle, but it's a certain way to think and perspective to work your way through it, because it is a lonely place. And I think there's something beautiful about the narrative of an author to a reader, or even just audio. It's pretty intimate, and I think you can really move the needle for somebody.
Yeah.
The more open and honest and vulnerable I am in sharing the narrative, the maybe more I have a chance at connecting with the reader or listener.
No doubt. The thing is about when you're in the middle of a struggle, it never seems like you're going to get out of it.
Yeah.
And you're trapped. You feel, and it's so difficult for people to trust the process or to trust that it will get better. And this is unfortunately why a lot of people end their lives, because they do not think it's going to get better. The beginning of the audio.
All right. So there's a few, and I've got two more clips from them and their conversation that I want to look through, listen through. But right there, okay, so you go through this traumatic experience. You go through this traumatic, life-altering, near-death experience, as Jeremy did. It doesn't all, and nobody's pain, nobody's trauma is going to be the same. That's something that we will unpack as we move forward. But it does have a purifying effect. Pain does. It clears away the white noise. You hear Jeremy saying that. It clears away the white noise. And now I just don't give a lot of time and attention to the things that are not important. But before my near-death experience, before the pain, before the trauma, I was probably lost in a world of comfort, essentially. Comfort has a way of sedating you and putting you to sleep and convincing you that things are okay when they're really not. I mean, even if we're not going through physical, emotional, mental trauma, this isn't really where we are. We're not supposed to be here. Things are not right. Things are not right. And that's why we have lost Eden, right? This is the idea of we've lost Eden, but where do we go from here? We don't go back to Eden. We don't go back to Eden. We actually move forward onto something that might even be better. That's maybe I'll post that theory out there. You let me know what you think. Because in the Bible, of course, God could have just set everything right? He could have gone back and after Adam and Eve fell into sin, God would have been right and justified in ending humanity there. But he doesn't. Why? Now he does kick them out of the garden, okay. But why? Because he has another plan, a plan that if we're willing to entertain it is actually a better Eden. It's not the old garden, it's actually a new city. And so when we have that perspective, when we have the new heaven and new earth perspective, historically, I think that allows you to endure pain and suffering, not in a, it'll all get better when I get to heaven type of mentality. But no, this moment that I'm going through right now, it's not purposeless. It's not the end of the story. The story continues, and this is a small part of the story, and I can locate myself in that story, and then my suffering can find a sense of meaning and purpose, and that's a transformative that's the transformative effect. And I think if we don't have that, then suffering is just suffering, pain is just pain, trauma is just trauma. And so I think Christianity has the answers for pain and trauma and suffering in this world. And it's not just things will get better in the end. It's that things can be quote unquote better now because we have a view of the end. And it is this view. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth passed away. There is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, a new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven of God, made ready like a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and I will dwell among them." Again, it's sort of Edenic. They shall be my people. And God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. Right? This is where a lot of pain and a lot of suffering comes from, right? There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. Now, it's interesting, not to just turn this into a Bible study, but if you go to Jesus and the Beatitudes, he basically says happy. These people, this word blessed, it's happy. Well, happy are what? The people who are broken and poor in spirit, the people who mourn, the people who are humble, who hunger and thirst. They're hungry and thirsty. The people who have been persecuted for the sake of for the sake of righteousness, right? So people who have endured persecution, they can find happiness, and that'll be kind of as we go into this next series of clips is Dan Allendar talking essentially, and again, not trying to put words in his mouth, but Dan does talk about this, post-traumatic growth, that people who have gone through suffering actually seem to have access to more happiness in life than those people who have not. People who have, and it's not that nobody goes, that's not really true. Everybody goes through some level of suffering, but people who have confronted their suffering, people who have confronted the trauma in their life, not only do they regain a sense of happiness, but it seems that they now, post-trauma, post-traumatic growth, actually have access to more happiness. They can access more happiness in their life because they've endured. It's a paradox. It's a paradoxical thing, but we see it in the cross. We see that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, right? The joy. He didn't begrudgingly go to the cross. He went to the cross happy. He went to the cross because of love. And that's kind of where this conversation goes with Joe and Jeremy. And that's one of the things that caused me to sort of pique my interest and say, well, isn't this a Christian theme? Isn't this a biblical theme? Where else do we get this blending together of suffering and love, if not in the cross of Jesus? And so even though Joe and Jeremy are both not Christians, there's this sort of deeply rooted Christian paradox that they're talking about. So again, at the very end of that last clip, if you were listening, you can go back and replay it or whatever you want. But Jeremy talked about the narrative, and Joe, in a sense, what he's saying is people who contemplate, their own solution to the problem, their own self-harm or whatever it is. Oftentimes it is because they are at the end, right? There's no other option. There's no other, the story doesn't go on from here. This is the end. And yet when we can share our stories with one another, it will help people, I think, gain that perspective that says, no, this is not the end. The story continues. But why you feel desperate is that you cannot locate yourself in the midst of the story. And when we share stories with one another, we help each other do that. We help each other locate. We help locate each other in the midst of the story. And I was just listening to Christian Baxter and Chad talk, and essentially they were talking about that, that sharing their own struggle with depression, and yet feeling that in the sharing of it, they found some sense of healing. And that is another part of this. There is a healing element to stories, to storytelling, to story sharing. There is something about the fact that God revealed himself in the Bible through narrative, through story, that we need to not ignore when it comes to sort of like these big questions and how we navigate life.
And now I realize, oh my God, I was so wrong. It does get better. I am better. Everything's better. And I just didn't see the light. I didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I thought there was just nothing but this feeling that I couldn't endure.
Yeah.
So that's him. We're recapping where that first clip touched off. And he's saying, people become hopeless because they don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. They don't see where they are. But when you can, then you will find that hope. I think that's real. I don't know. What do you guys think?
And now I realize, oh my God, I was so wrong. It does get better. I am better. Everything's better. And I just didn't see the light. I didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I thought there was just nothing but this feeling that I couldn't endure.
Yeah. That hopelessness, that weighs heavy, doesn't it? You can't afford that. You can't give that power. You can't give that value. You can't. I think anybody can sink into that, right?
Anybody can sink into that.
Yeah.
Anybody can sink into that. It's just so hard for people that have never gone through something before. If your life has been really easy, and then all of a sudden you're tasked with one of the most difficult burdens ever, overcoming the fear and that feeling of wanting to end life because you can't take it.
Yeah, I've been there. I mean, Jesus. I think people need to suffer. It is an actual requirement of life. And is the fiber, the DNA of love. Real love and true love and in perpetuity can't exist without suffering.
What do you think about that? See, of course, I don't want to read my Christian worldview into a conversation. Again, these guys are not necessarily talking about this from the biblical Christian worldview. But he's talking about self-sacrificial love, the type of love that Jeremy received after his near-death experience because other people who loved him stopped their lives and gave up something of their lives and sacrificed something to be there with him while he recovered from pain. There's something to that. What do you guys think? What do you think?
It's impossible.
We don't appreciate it.
Yeah, you have to have suffering. Yeah. And suffering doesn't have to be looked at as a negative thing. It can be looked at as a beautiful thing. It's where real love comes out of.
Yeah.
All my suffering, there was real love in there. There's real love that comes in that suffering, even though it can be a lonely experience. I mean, I look at it that way and not as a negative, terrible thing because it's just temporary.
And it's so counterintuitive, though.
What's that?
It's counterintuitive.
In a negative term of it, right?
Yeah.
But we all have to suffer. Right. I mean, it's part of the human experience, right?
Yeah.
It's the Joe Rogan experience. I'm not suffering. I'm having a great time with you. But, I don't think people welcome that or allow that to happen in their lives and let it be okay, that the suffering that we suffer, like that, at the hard times, are the building blocks to who we are.
It builds resilience.
Yeah.
It builds character.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
builds all those things.
Yeah.
I remember one time, this is a minor suffering in comparison. I went on this hunting trip on Prince of Wales Island, which rains like 350 days a year. And so we were up there for a week just getting drenched. And, you're camping, so you're in a tent, and you think, oh, well, I'll be dry in the tent. And you're not dry in the tent. There's no dry. And, it was just miserable, but fun. I was with good friends, and we had a good time. Then I came back to L.A., a week later, and I remember I called my friend Steve Renner. I called because he's the one who took me on the trip, and I said, dude, it's sunny out, and I've never appreciated the sun like this before.
Yeah.
I'm at a level of happiness that I don't think I've ever felt before. I was just sitting outside with my eyes closed, just taking the sun. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
LA's always sunny.
Yeah.
You get so used to it.
Yeah.
It's like you're a trust fund kid, who can't
True.
appreciate money
Right.
because you've always had it. It doesn't mean anything to you. But now all of a sudden being drenched for 7 days and being in that sun, I was like, and then it made me realize, like, oh, you need to suffer. You need to suffer. You're never going to appreciate this life.
Right.
And either you voluntarily suffer or you will suffer involuntarily because regular life will make you suffer.
Yeah, very true.
And now I realize,
Man, okay. Suffering is universal. I mean, that's part of this conversation, which I think, not many people want to hear that. People want to hear, oh, everything's going to be fine, which I think ultimately that is true. I think ultimately things are going to be fine. But here and now, it is suffering. I just, Joe's story about being on that island and being drenched and being in the storm and being constantly wet, and then going back to LA where it's sunny and warm and you can dry yourself out and you can take in the warmth. It's like, oh, but when I was in LA, I probably was like tired of the sun. I was probably just like, oh, it's always sunny here, whatever. I'm probably being like, upset that it's, too dry or something like that. And so that's the idea of comfort sedating you, and suffering brings you to life. And maybe suffering is not my enemy. Maybe suffering is exactly what we needed, which is why God kicked us out of Eden and didn't just start over with Eden. Does that make sense? Like, what is the possible reason for God if we were made for Eden, and humanity sins and falls into rebellion, and God goes, man, this is going to lead to death. This sin, this rebellion, it's going to ultimately lead to death, which is not what I made you for. I didn't make you for death. I made you for life. I made you for the garden, but you've chosen rebellion. And instead of remaking the world and starting over with a new Eden and a new Adam and a new Eve, he says, look, I got a plan for you. We've lost Eden, but maybe there's a reason why. Maybe there's something about God that we would not have known if we stayed in Eden. What do you think? What if we had stayed in Eden? We wouldn't know the cross. We wouldn't know. Is there something about the self-sacrificial love of God we would have never seen? And God says, you know what? I don't affirm your rebellion. This is not what we want. It's still rebellion. But, and you hear this at the end of Genesis, Joseph says, what you determined for evil, God used for good. So in a sense, the beginning of Genesis is like that. It's like what you determined for evil, I can use for good. What if we had stayed in Eden? Would we have not gotten that perspective? The perspective that Joe is talking about when he went back to LA and the sun was shining. The blessed curse for a reason. Very interesting. Shout out to Matt C. Good to see you, man. Yeah, the light after the storm, the blessing after the curse. Real love mixed with suffering was something else that Jeremy was talking about. And I think that is just, it's very interesting that we have been convinced that we can live life without suffering. Buy this product, take this medication, do this thing, and you will have joy. And yet the truth is, you got to learn how to endure suffering, and then you have joy. C.S. Lewis said, joy, the joy that he wrote a book called Surprised by Joy. And in it, he said, it doesn't begin with joy. Life doesn't begin with joy. It begins with dismay. But it's no use trying to go on to that joy without first going through that dismay. And I think the idea that Lewis is dealing with there is we can convince ourselves that we could have joy without going through dismay, but what we get is a superficial joy. We don't get real joy. We don't get the blessedness that Jesus is talking about in the Beatitudes. We don't get this blessed, and I know that's an overused sort of Christianese word, but we don't get that true happiness. Maybe suffering is not my enemy, or maybe in the hands of God. I'll say it like this. In the hands of God, if we turn our suffering, our pain over to the hands of God, suffering no longer is our enemy. What you determine for evil, God used for good. But if we try to manage it, then I think it does turn against us. It turns against us, and it is our enemy, I think. I don't know. There's something to that. What do you guys think? We think we shouldn't have to suffer, and where does this idea come from? This is very
Precedented levels of
ideas here, and I wonder if you guys are picking up on it. Maybe I'm fooling myself, but tell me what you think.
That leads to a life of complacency and mediocrity.
Well, if you look at life today, and if you look at society today, we have unprecedented levels of depression and unprecedented levels of anxiety and unhappiness. Yet, it's probably the safest time ever. And it's probably the easiest time ever. All throughout history, poor people were starving. Yeah. And poor people are fat now. Like, that's how easy it is to live, just to exist. Yeah. So, I mean, not saying that being poor is easy. It's certainly not. This is certainly a struggle. But it's way easier than starving to death. Like, this is like an unprecedented easy time. And because of that, and because there's this narrative that people have to constantly seek comfort, to seek vacation and relaxation and retirement and all that bullshit, there's this softness to existence. And so everything that comes your way is overwhelming. Somebody said this once, and it's like a great quote that I remember. The worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you, regardless of how small that is. So if the worst thing that's ever happened to you is like, I remember my girlfriend broke up with me when I was 18, and I was like, oh, I couldn't believe it. I thought I was going to be with her forever. I was so sad. Yeah. Back then, I thought like life was over, right?
Yeah, of course.
But you have to get through that in order to appreciate life, to really appreciate life. But we have this bizarre narrative in our head that you shouldn't suffer.
I know. Where does that come from?
Well, because it used to be so difficult to live.
We have this bizarre narrative in our head that we shouldn't have to suffer.
Have this bizarre narrative in our head that you shouldn't suffer.
I know. Where does that come from?
I think it comes from Eden. I think it comes from our original home, which is a place of peace and comfort and harmony. And I wonder if it is not just that, but it's this ache for the new heavens and the new earth. It's this aching for a world where there will be no suffering, no mourning. It's interesting. I will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And it's this imagery. He doesn't say, I'm just going to undo. It's like tears, the tears are required. The tears are there, but you have a heavenly Father who cares for you, who will draw near to you in a time of suffering and be the one who wipes away your tears for you. So we can come to know God in a way that maybe we would not have if we never left Eden. If we never cried, if we never had to mourn the death of a loved one. Like, we see this loving Father imagery because we have gone through suffering, not in spite of it. We think we shouldn't have to suffer. Where does that idea come from? It's a clue. It's a clue that we're not made for a world of suffering. It's a clue that this is not meant to be. But again, the paradox is not just, okay, God's out of control. God can't do anything about it, or God doesn't love us enough to do anything about it. It's that there's a bigger plan. There's a bigger story that we have to understand going on. Joe talks about this this sort of phenomenon that no matter how much you have suffered, that's how much you sort of needed to say. He doesn't say that. Let me see if I can re-find it.
Seek vacation and relaxation and retirement and all that bullshit. There's this softness to existence. And so everything that comes your way is overwhelming. Somebody said this once, and it's like a great quote that I remember. The worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you, regardless of how small that is.
The worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you, regardless of how small that is. So it's not small to the person experiencing it. And that's one of the really interesting things about the universal nature of suffering is interesting because it's actually not really universal, right? Well, I'll say this. I felt bad at a time in my life because I felt a lot of pain, because I felt betrayed. I felt overlooked. I felt like I had lost someone in my life, not because they died, not because they passed away, but because essentially they ended our relationship. And you must think to yourself like, oh, it would be better to mourn the death of someone than to be rejected by someone, right? You have a loved one that dies, at least they died loving you. They didn't abandon you or reject you or despise you. But when you love someone and they have despised you, I mean, that is brutal. And that is essentially what Jesus went through. He went through the greatest act of love, and the greatest moment of pain were there on the cross with the person of Jesus, right? Because in that moment, he takes on the sin and feels that rejection, the rejection of being cast out of Eden, what we really deserved, right? That's that we broke fellowship and we broke relationship with God. We chose sin over love, and that betrayal is a hard one. And so it hurts, but you sit there and you mope and you think, oh my gosh, what a loser, right? You're sort of moping over this thing and no big deal, get over it, rub some dirt on it, get over it or whatever. And I think in that moment you're like, well, maybe somebody else would have felt differently about this suffering, but for me, it's crushing me. It is crushing me. And so there's a dosage that God understands that we need, that he alone knows. He knows that we need it. He knows the exact amount. He knows the exact dosage. And I think there's some adage out there that it's like, it's not the medicine, but the dose that is the cure or something like that. And I think like if we think of pain in some ways as sort of like a medicine, not that we should go chasing it or anything like that, but we should, I think, surrender it to God for healing. It's the dose. God knows the dose. Almighty Om, good to see you. Good to see you. Good afternoon. And this is, I mean, I don't know what other Christians do with this passage. This passage boggled my mind. But speaking of the death, the cross of Jesus, Hebrews 5 says this, although he was a son, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. So there's even something that Jesus acknowledged, that God the Father acknowledged, that Jesus is like, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. How do I understand that? I don't know, but it does at least give me this sense that Jesus he didn't avoid this problem. He went straight after it. He went through it just as we have to go through it. And he got the exact right dosage, just as God gives us sort of our own dose. And having been made perfect, we could unpack that one. He became, for all those who obey him, a source of eternal salvation. And so we have this being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Concerning him, we have much to say. It's hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. But basically we have this high priest who is familiar with our suffering. Now, here's what's crazy about this. Here's what's crazy about the suffering of Jesus. I had just a second ago mentioned that although pain is universal, everybody's pain is distinctly their own. So how is it that you have a priest who's familiar with your suffering? Is that just sort of in a generic way? No, I think when it comes to Jesus, he actually knows exactly how you suffered. I had a couple of friends of mine and I, we had a mutual friend who died in a car accident. And so 4 of us, we lost one friend. So there was 3 friends of mine. There was more people involved, but for the sake of simplifying the story, my 2 friends and I lost a friend. They were there when he died. They were actually there on the road when he was hit by a truck and he died. He was a little bit older than us. He had 2 young children at the time, a wife and 2 young children at the time. And they were with him before he died. And I was there with his wife and children. And I was there when we had to tell his kids that their dad had died. So all 3 of us lost a friend, but all 3 of us lost a friend in a very different way. We could sort of empathize with one another about the loss of our friend. But we couldn't really. Like, even though we had all lost the same friend, we all experienced that loss in our own unique way. And so even in the midst of something like that, where I can look at my friend and say, man, I know how you feel. I know that you're in pain, and I know something of the pain that you're experiencing. The truth is, I don't know exactly how you feel. I don't know how you experience the loss of John versus how I experienced the loss of John. How you experienced being there on the scene versus how I experienced being there with his family. We couldn't really empathize. But when it comes to the person of Jesus and this idea of him as the great high priest who's familiar with our suffering, because he is God and man, he can experience our suffering as a man, as you and I experience it, because he is human. But because he's God, he has the infinite capacity to experience everyone's suffering just as they suffer it, if that makes sense. That is the ministry of Christ. That is the ministry that he can accomplish as the great high priest, because he didn't avoid this thing that we have to confront, this suffering, this very universal experience for humanity that we suffer. And that's the self-sacrificial love that I think, in a way, in a very small way, Joe and Jeremy are acknowledging that suffering and love are intermixed. And in fact, it takes this suffering sometimes to be more aware of how potent the love is that we experience in life. Jesus sacrificed himself. Jesus left heaven. Again, God could have kicked us out of Eden and left us there and just started over and started over. He didn't have to sacrifice himself. But God in his infinite wisdom, as he kicks Adam and Eve out of Eden, he's thinking of the cross. He's thinking, I have a better solution for you. Yes, we lose Eden, but we'll gain something even more. will gain something. I'll give you something a great mystery that you would not have otherwise understood if we had stayed in Eden in a perfect state. So that is again, they're touching on something here in this conversation that is very deep and very meaningful. And again, they didn't say it like this, so I'm not trying to put words in Joe and Jeremy's mouth, but I am trying to add to the conversation, because I think the question of what is that is a very good one. Why do we feel like we shouldn't be suffering? We need something to keep our egos at bay. Yes, that's true. Universal, perennial truth. Yeah. His time in the wilderness. Yeah. Jesus' time in the wilderness. Empathy is hard. It's an earned skill. I think so. But it's also an acknowledgement that I don't want to patronize people and say, I know how you feel. The truth is, I don't know how you feel. I kind of know how you feel. There is one who truly knows how you feel, and that is Christ. That is Jesus, the great high priest, who's familiar with our suffering, who is tempted in every way and yet without sin, right? I link this to how many traumatized children are much more empathetic. Yeah. Trauma can damage, but it can create change, growth. Yeah, we're going to listen to this Dan Allendar clip here in a second. Sorry, I'm leaning over. Anyway, I'll do an announcement here at the end, but one of the things that I need to fix is my desk. Traumatized children. Now, here's something from Almighty Om. Traumatized children, in a sense, we have two paths, right? We can become more empathetic, but there's also the fact that if that trauma never receives healing, it leads to more trauma. There's a perpetual trauma that can take place. And so hurt people will hurt people, traumatize people, victims become the victimizers, that type of thing. Trauma can damage, but it can create change, growth, yeah. And when we can acknowledge that pain, suffering, even evil is, I don't want to say has a place, but ultimately can be used, right? This is what Joseph says to his brothers: what you determined for evil, God used for good. So it's, I think, something that Augustine said, right? God is so good and so powerful that he can even turn evil into good. He transforms evil. And that's, again, part of what Dan Allendar here is talking about, but even to sort of connect it to the Joe Rogan and the Jeremy Renner conversation, there's something of the healing nature of story that we also need to acknowledge here, and that we are made this way. We're made for a story. We're made as a story. I don't know. I'll let Dan say it because he says it better.
Will you tell us how you use story in your therapeutic work?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I should have said Dan Allendar is a therapist. He's a, I guess, world-renowned, very skilled, very successful therapist. He wrote a book called The Healing Path, which is where I first heard of Dan's work. And so the question is, how do you use story as therapy?
Will you tell us how you use story in your therapeutic work?
Yeah, let's just start with this, that 70% of the Bible is story. So if you have a heart to know God, then you can't know God without engaging the story of the people of God. And from Genesis through Revelation, story, story, story. So we're immersed in story. And yet, often we don't realize that our own story is revelatory, meaning we reveal God. We reveal in our body, we reveal something about the goodness of God. But we do so through revealing Jesus's death and resurrection and ascension. So what we're beginning with the word story is, you don't just have stories, you are a story. And you're meant to reveal in and of your own story and your body, something of the story of death, resurrection, and ascension. And that, I think, makes our life as it is so important, no matter who you are, where you are, what age you are. All of our lives reveal.
All of our lives reveal. Man. You don't just have a story. You are a story. God tells us in Ephesians 2, Paul is writing, he says, "For we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we might walk in them." This word, poema, is a fascinating one. It's one I'm sure we will explore more, but it is not just, the idea that we would get from the Greek is the word poetry, but 2,000 years ago, they understood this word, not maybe more in a more full way than the modern people would think of it. It is a craftsmanship. It is a work of art made with words, and that's something. There's a resonance. There's a healing that happens when we come into harmony. And I don't. Dang it, I knew I was going to forget this lady's name. Catherine Wolf, I think is her name.
Will you tell us how?
She runs a podcast called Good Hard Stories. And I believe she suffered a stroke. She's dealing with paralysis. And one of the things that she said was the switch for her in hating her trauma to loving and embracing it is seeing herself in a different light and being able to love who she is now moving forward. And just that shift alone, it's like you are his workmanship. The craftsmanship, the thing that he made you for, includes this trauma, includes this pain. And that's not to diminish the pain. It's very real pain. But there's a purpose for it, you can find a purpose for it. And those who find the purpose find love. Those who find the purpose find healing. Those who find the purpose can extend love and healing to others. And those who don't just get crushed by it. And the pain turns inward and we become selfish and self-loathing. But when we realize that harmonizing with the story is part of the healing. When I rebelled against God, why did you cause me to have a stroke? God, why did you cause my friend to die? And we rebel against God and we say, your story sucks. It's trash and I hate it. Then we're in disharmony and then pain is multiplied. The pain of the trauma is relived over and over and over again. And one of the things that Dan is trying to teach people is that we don't have to live in that cycle. We don't have to live in that cycle of trauma repeating itself. We can go into a new narrative, a new story, and say, okay, I don't know why God allowed this to happen, but my circumstances do not determine my theology. My theology helps me define my circumstances. And if I can understand that, now I can come into harmony and there's a resonance and there's a healing. We are created in Christ Jesus. Do you see that? The man who did not avoid pain and suffering, but left the kingdom. He left heaven, and came down to earth and suffered and died, as we all will. So we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus. Now, if his life was just all peaches and cream and sunshine and cha-chas, then we'd be like, oh, we would have something to be really pissed off about. But if we look at the life of Christ and we realize he was despised by those he loved, he was forsaken, he suffered and died then we go, okay, then I can expect my story to follow the same pattern. But the thing that Dan points to in this clip is ascension, right? That's his Jesus' suffering and death is not the end of the story. There's new life and ascended life that happens for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we might walk in them. So we can step into, and I say all this stuff, and I go, man, it's really easy to say it, right? Oh, you can just walk in that story, that new narrative, that new whatever. And the truth is, this would be very challenging for me, right? If I leave here and I get in a car accident and I'm paralyzed from the waist down, what will the future self? What will my future self be saying to my present self as I sort of just say these things as though they're easy? It's easy to say them. It's different to walk through them. It's different to be like, and again, I believe her name is Catherine. It's different to be like Jeremy, who was freaking crushed under the weight of a snowcat and nearly lost his life. It's easy to say those things, but these people are proof that you can actually walk through them, I think, and that this reality of God's story is the truth. It's more real than even the reality. What am I saying? Like, it's more real than even the reality of our suffering. What I'm saying is what C.S. Lewis said in The Great Divorce, which is heaven is more real than this world, right? That I am a ghost by comparison to that world and that reality. And I think we're touching on it in some level when we can walk in the good works he has prepared beforehand. As we are created in Christ, we are his poema, we are his workmanship. I think there's something to that. And I really appreciate Joe Rogan and Jeremy Renner for that conversation. I really appreciate Dan Allendar and his work. I will continue to unpack the nature of story and why I think it's powerful and important for us. Well, thank you for checking out this video. I will leave links and relevant information in the description, as well as suggesting future videos that you might be interested in. So thank you for the support that you show for this channel, and I'll catch you in the next one.